Welcome to another Digital Dairy Sunday School. This week we're going to talk about tribes and stories of violence in the Old Testament. Doesn't that sound exciting? Last week we did Leviticus and now we're on tribes and violence. Now we talked a little bit last week that the culture of the Hebrew Scriptures, what we call the Old Testament. Remember, we're not the only ones who find those texts sacred. They are a standalone important scripture for the Jewish faith. So what we call maybe the Old Testament, these are the Hebrew Scriptures. And we have to understand that the culture, the context of that writing is very different than our current culture. It's an entirely different worldview. So to understand the Scriptures, we need to read them with ancient eyes, through the lens of their worldview first. Now we can apply our worldview, our culture to the Scriptures too. But we first need to understand the text as it was originally written before we try to adapt it to our own culture. To understand the world of the Hebrew Scriptures, we need to talk about tribes. Now, in the ancient Near East, your tribe was your family, your bloodline, your home, your identity. Your tribe was everything, and everyone belonged to a tribe. You worked for the well-being of your tribe, and as did everyone else in the tribe. You accumulated possessions, fought battles, made alliances, all in the name of tribal preservation. And if you did something unacceptable, something shameful, it reflected poorly on your tribe, and that could affect everyone else. Now in Genesis 12, God calls a man named Abram to be the father, the leader of a new tribe. Abram later had his name changed to Abraham. He had many sons, and many sons had Father Abraham, and I am one of them, and so are you. But then added to the promise to Abraham is, and all the peoples of the earth will be blessed through you. Now, tribes, also called nations in the Hebrew Scripture, at that time existed for their own well-being, for their own preservation. It was tribalism is a lot like nationalism. You are in it for you and yours. You don't care about anyone else. That's how the tribal system worked. It's very much nationalism, nativism. But Abram was told his tribe will be a blessing to all people. This tribe, the one that Abram would lead, would be different. This tribe would exist to bless all the other tribes, all the other nations. And this was a brand new idea. Now, as this tribe of Abram's kids grew, they carried with them this sense of that calling, this sense that they were different, that they had a unique role to play in the world. Now remember in the Genesis story, in the chapter before we meet Abraham, chapter 11, humanity had lost its way to such a degree that they were building this giant tower to protect themselves from God, to have control over their destiny, and even have control over other humans. The Tower of Babel story is one of my favorite in Scripture. It's so interesting the different ways you can look at that story. I think we'll maybe study that for Sunday school in a couple weeks. But imagine if humanity had gained a head of steam in the wrong direction, how do you change things? You start a new tribe, a new humanity, a tribe that would move with, not against, God. Now a bit more about tribes. Tribes had gods and goddesses, forces they followed and worshipped who they believed protected and guided them. So when you went into battle against another tribe, usually for land or access to resources or wealth, you were doing battle with them, but at the same time your God was confronting their God. That's actually the subtext to the David and Goliath story. It's not just about Israel and the Philistines. It's not just about David and Goliath. It's about Yahweh and these other gods. Now, if you won the battle, you wiped them out and you took all their stuff. Now, why would you do that? Well, the reason then is simple, because if you left some of the men alive, then they later banded together. Maybe the son of the king you killed was their leader. They would come and they would seek revenge. You couldn't risk it. We see all kinds of stories, movies, even times in history where the survivors of something band together and they seek revenge. The tribe couldn't risk that, which is why they would kill everyone they could. It sounds horrible, but again, in the worldview where you exist for your tribe only, you will do whatever it takes to protect your tribe. Or maybe you killed the men, but you took the women for yourselves, and the donkeys and whatever else you wanted. Those were called the spoils of war. There were rules about how this worked because tribes have been doing it this way for a long time. A lot of those rules are actually in the law section of the Torah, those first 5 books of the Bible. Was it brutal? Yes. Violent? Yep. Primitive even? Yeah. Barbaric? Yeah, at least from our worldview. But the law in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, is actually, at that time, a big step forward because it codified some of the rules and was more gracious, especially toward women. Yes, by our culture, it's still pretty horrible. But at the time, some of the rules provided more protection and rights to women and victims than had been previously experienced. Remember that progression thing we talked about last week. Always moving a bit forward. You don't suddenly take it leaps and bounds. Society never changes overnight in these giant steps. It's a little step forward and a little step forward. Now, your tribal identity wasn't just about your bloodline and your gods. It was about safety. The world was extremely dangerous. And without the protection of a tribe, you could easily find yourself enslaved or worse by another tribe. We like to think nowadays like the world is more dangerous now than it used to be. No, it's not. It used to be much, much more dangerous. Where actually, violence as a whole is going down every year. To understand this old worldview, the world of tribes, it was violence all the time. You never knew when someone would come and just chop off your head. There were battles and skirmishes all the time. It was an extremely dangerous world. And so you needed your tribe to protect yourself. This was not like picking a modern political party or religious affiliation. Your survival was at stake. Now, when you read those Old Testament stories about so-and-so accumulating so many fighting men and a certain amount of swords or horses or camels or making an alliance with King so-and-so, this wasn't a hobby. This was life and death, kill or be killed. And no matter how many battles you'd fought and won, you were always one battle away from the enemy crushing you and wiping out your entire tribe or killing some of you and taking the rest back to be assimilated into the conqueror's tribe. You know, there's stories in the Old Testament. There's one in the book of one of the Samuels in which the Israelites are surrounded by enemies and they're sure they're about to get wiped out, that they will no longer cease to be a tribe anymore. They think this is the end. And they pray to God, saying, God, help us, because just the only way we're going to survive this. And the text says that God shows up and they routed their enemies and they chased them for a ways, and eventually the prophet Samuel stops and raises a stone, an altar to God, signifying that thus far has the Lord helped. And he called that stone Ebenezer. That's where we get the line from the song, Come Thou Fount, here I raise my Ebenezer. It means here I signify God has helped, because at that place, at that moment, the Israelites were sure they would be wiped out forever, annihilated. That was always the threat. That thinking still exists in the mind of Israel today, because that hasn't completely gone away from them. We might think, well, the world is different now. But for the Jewish people, not that long ago, there was another threat of being wiped out completely. We don't have that ingrained worldview in us in the same way. And so we have to change our thinking a bit to read the scripture through those ancient eyes. But this threat of always being annihilated, of someone coming in, taking your stuff, killing everyone, is part of the reason why Hospitality is so important in the Hebrew Scriptures. When strangers wandered into your camp, you invited them in and cared for them and made sure they were treated well, because the slightest snub or inhospitality could set off who knows what kind of inter-conflict of violence. You needed allies. You didn't want to rub anyone the wrong way, treat anyone badly, because not only could your life be at stake, the life of your whole tribe could be at stake. Which is actually what's going on in the story about Sodom and Gomorrah. It's not about any kind of sexual misconduct, really. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah is about hospitality to strangers. And when that doesn't happen, bad things happen for your whole tribe. Our modern sensibilities get so narrowed in on one little thing, we actually miss the bigger story. It's like the story of Jonah. When we get sucked into the story about Jonah being in the fish, we actually miss the point of the story. We miss the point of the Sodom and Gomorrah story completely, usually. That's another one maybe we should look at for a Digital Dairy Sunday School coming up. Now, imagine what would happen if the tribe next door suddenly obtained a new technology like iron or bronze. It would be terrifying knowing that if there was a battle, you would be outgunned. It's like at the beginning of World War II when the Nazis march into Poland and the Polish cavalry ride out to meet them on horses and swords to face machine guns and tanks. Spoiler alert, it did not go well. Or I think back to the movie The Last Samurai with Tom Cruise, when Tom Cruise and the samurai are charging the new modern Japanese army, and the samurai have horses and swords and bow and arrow. And they're actually doing okay for a while until the Japanese army comes out with basically Gatling gun, machine gun, and just mow them down. A change in technology changes the balance. What changed the balance of World War II in the end? Atomic weapons. One side had them, one side did not. That's why there's such fear if one side gets a new technology, which is another little piece of the Tower of Babel story. But that's also the tension between the Philistines and the Israelites during the David and Goliath story. So we'll talk more about that later, but when one side has these iron chariots, suddenly you are afraid there's no way we're going to survive this. So it's in this world, at this time, we read the story of a man called to be the father of a new nation, a new tribe, one that would exist not just for its own self-preservation, but for a much higher purpose, to bless all other tribes. This is the story of Abraham's tribe, also called Israel. This was a radical idea that took a while to catch on, which is why Jesus keeps reminding people of their original calling. He keeps reminding Israel about why they were created in the first place. It was difficult to make this kind of leap in a culture in which tribal affiliation and preservation was the highest value. That we are out for me and mine and ours. And no matter what you'd been told about who you are and what your calling was, you would still have a filter, a lens, a way that you saw the world that said, no, it's my tribe and that's all that's important. It took generations upon generations. And we still struggle with that today. That we're called to be a blessing to the world, not just for our people. I hope you can see how easy it would have been to win a battle and slaughter everyone in the tribe you defeated, and then give God, your God, credit, later telling stories about how your God told you to do it. That's kind of the context we're in, that you have a battle, my God won because I won, and God told me to do this. It was easy to do. And there are lots of examples of these stories in texts around the ancient Near East and in our Bible. So it's not just in the Old Testament you see this kind of thinking. All the different cultures, the different tribes wrote these kind of stories about how God told them to attack this tribe, and when they won, they give their God credit and say, my God is stronger than your God. It's not just the Israelites who are doing this. We still see this today. I mean, athletes still give credit to God when they score, or fans when their team wins. It's still ingrained in us. God made the Eagles victorious. God must be an Eagles fan more than a Patriots fan, or something like that. We all kind of claim our God is the reason why we win. But what about when they lose? And if people claim the same God, it gets sticky. But this whole idea of my God is stronger than your God, which pervaded the ancient Near East, in which tribes were doing battle with other tribes, and basically gods were doing battles with other gods. This type of belief is called henotheism. It's basically the my God can beat up your God of religious philosophies. We see it in the Psalms, the stories of the prophets of Baal versus Elijah. Do you remember that story when Elijah gives kind of a challenge throwdown to the prophets of Baal? And they're like, okay, we'll get Baal, the storm god, the god of lightning, to consume this giant bull on an altar, and that'll show Baal is more powerful. And then the prophets of Baal are all trying to do this. They can't do anything. So then Elijah comes in and says, I'm going to up the ante even. I'm going to build a trench around my bull, covered with water, throw water on the bull, and still my God will consume it. And God sends down lightning, consumes the bull, and Elijah's like, mic drop, booyah. It was meant to be a humiliating story, a story that shows my God can beat up your God. The tribal culture and henotheism is what leads this idea, this attitude, this worldview. This is what leads to many of those violent stories that we find problematic today in the Bible, that we read and we're like, well, what do we do with that? How do we read these horribly violent stories of people killing all the men, women, and children? Well, we'll get to that next week, and we'll read more about those violent stories and how we tell and how they told God's stories at the time.